Welcome to the Ephesiology Podcast and our series, Archaeology Meets Missiology, the mission of God in the records of time. Today we have Michael, our resident ephesiologist, and I'm Andrew Johnson in Houston, Texas. And we are so happy to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Greer. Now, Dr. Greer is an archaeologist and a biblical scholar with research interests in ancient Israelite religion, sacrifice, and feasting. He earned his PhD from the Pennsylvania State University, where he focused on the Hebrew Bible, ancient Near Eastern studies, and archaeology. He was formerly a professor of Old Testament and the director of the Hesse Archaeological Laboratory at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. He is the associate director of excavations at Tel Dan in Israel and has published a number of works on the relationship of the Bible to the ancient world. Dr. Greer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it was so fun for me to come across you, not hardly even a stone's throw away from me. I didn't even know that our local university had an archaeology department until coming across your name, and so thankful that when I reached out, you were gracious enough to accept a coffee meeting and had a wonderful conversation about your work at Tel Dan. So thanks, Jonathan, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Okay, so Jonathan, for the uninformed, what is the Tel Dan site? I don't want to say what's the significance of that. I think that'll probably come out, but just in general, what is the Tel Dan site that you are working with in Israel?
Sure. So I don't know what kind of background most of your listeners will have, but the first part of the name Tel is a reference to an artificial mound that's created by layer upon layer of ruined civilization. So Tel is the not part of the name technically, but a descriptive term there. And then the name of the site, Tel Dan or Tel Dan, derives its name from a biblical site that most would identify with these ruined remains. Its Arabic name is Tel El Qadi, which means the mound of the judge, which is interesting in terms of the study of ancient place names, in that the word Dan means judge. So there's some, this would be an irregular preservation perhaps of an original name. But it's been excavated since the 1960s by the late Avraham Biran, and then in the 2000s under the directorship of David Elan, and now and then co-directed with Yifat Thariani, and now Yifat has taken over the directorship of the dig. So it's been active in kind of the second wave since the early 2000s. But already in the 1960s, with what began as a salvage expedition under Avraham Biran, the significance of the site was recognized right away. As we've continued our excavations, where we've now have a fuller picture of the site with remains that go back all the way to the Neolithic period. We have extensive early bronze ramparts. We have wonderful late Bronze Age material from the middle of the second millennium BCE. But for most of your interests of most of your hearers here would be the so-called biblical period, the first millennium BCE. And as we were joking about leading up to the recording, everything's debated. So there's a lot of debate about some of the early strata. A stratum is an archaeological layer, and how we date those is part of the debate. And then how that dating and that material culture relates to things we read in the Bible is another matter of debate. But in the way that Biran understood the site, he saw most of the extensive building efforts that he attributed in his historical reconstruction to the famous, or rather infamous, biblical king Ahab, in terms of what is present there, and also Jeroboam II. But the earliest phase he associated with the stories of Jeroboam I, And so, if you remember in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, upon the death of Samuel, there's a division of the kingdom into north and south. And the king of the north, Jeroboam, builds temples to rival the temple in Jerusalem. And he builds one at Bethel and one at none other than Dan. And
Hmm.
so there was an archaeological material that very clearly can be associated with a religious site on this mound. The dating again is a bit debated, and most of the material comes from a time later than Jeroboam. But you have this association of a major temple built at a site that is named in the Hebrew Bible, and it becomes in many ways our best example, our best archaeologically preserved example of the royal Israelite cult from
Hmm.
any time period. So it's significant, massively significant in so many ways as a window into an early form of ancient Israelite religion, as we can determine that from the material remains, and then has this whole second wave of fascination in the way that it may relate to some of the stories that are preserved in the Bible about historically what was going on at that site. Um,
Very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and then it continues, I should say too, into the Roman and Hellenistic period, and we have intertestamental biblical literature, First Enoch,
Hmm.
for example, that also continue that idea of religious affiliation at the site.
So this already raises a gazillion questions in regards to the relationship between the North and the South in
Sure.
Israel, the northern tribes and the southern tribes,
Hmm.
and uh, and the similarities and distinctions between the religious practices of the two. And are these things that you're able to discern in that archaeological record at Tel Dan?
Yeah, that's been one at least aim of a lot of my research is to look at kind of Northern Israelite religion in comparison to Southern
Uh-huh.
Israelite
Hmm.
religion. And one might think if we're reading the biblical text, we often get the North gets a bad rap because
Right.
when we look down the road, they are the first to fall and fall to Assyria, and their idolatry is emphasized in the biblical text. But of course, if we read closely the biblical text in its own presentation of the data, the South is just as idolatrous
Mm,
as the North.
Right.
And also, if we read carefully, there are also these preservations, these memories of what we might associate with Orthodox Israelite religion. One of the times where this really jumped out at me is in reading the denouncement of the prophet Amos, a prophet from the south going to the north. And in his denouncement of the north, he never says anything about them worshiping other gods. There's one tiny reference at the end of chapter 5 that's highly debated, and then a few other in terms of its textual soundness and how we understand text critically that verse.
Okay.
But there are no explicit condemnations of idolatry like we get for biblical books addressing what's going on in the South, but
Hmm.
rather it assumes an orthodox practice of Yahwism. So again, in chapter 5, where you have the prophet denouncing their religious feasts, the description there uses all of these terms that are associated with proper Israelite worship according to the prescriptions in priestly materials. So the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the songs, the sacred feasts. And then, Amos says, but this is all worthless because it's devoid of justice and the poor are trampled underfoot. But that assumes some degree of Yahwistic practice that would then coordinate with what a prophet from the south would think would be proper. And then in the archaeological remains, some of my work I've tried to draw out potential congruences between
Hmm.
what is found in the material and biological record and some of these priestly prescriptions, and found a certain degree of resonance with the way that Israelite sacrifice was prescribed and described in biblical texts. Of course, it's not so simple. You get into dating issues and the like. And one, I think, interesting new direction in some of my studies is that in some ways, some of these traditions, these priestly traditions, line up better for northern shrines than they do for southern shrines.
Really?
So this
Okay.
invites a whole host of new questions.
Well, and new suspicions, I would imagine, and all sorts of attempts to answer those questions. So,
Absolutely.
so you're seeing a continuity, but at some level between North and South.
Mhm.
But so how are you wrestling with the South becoming the focal point of Yahwehism versus what you're seeing in the North that seems still to emphasize the same?
Yeah, I think it's really because of the way the biblical text has been preserved and the latest version certainly being curated within the context of Jerusalem. But in the earliest phase of Israelite religion, and again, even by the self-presentation of the text, there's a lot more religious diversity going on in terms of the number of worship centers and the activities that were carried out at the worship centers, and things become more restricted later in the biblical period. And then everything is kind of looked at retrospectively through the Jerusalem lens, and the stories then told that way.
Okay. So what happens? I mean, this is really fascinating, Jonathan. Thank you.
Agreed.
What happens when we fast forward to first century? And because you're saying that there's still a continuous archaeological presence
Yeah.
that you're seeing in there. So I mean, help us wrestle with that a little bit.
Well, you can, I would say I'll just wrestle along with you in that.
Okay.
Right.
So first of all, a full disclaimer here. That's really beyond my specific research area, the first century. But it is there's some interesting dynamics with the relationship of North and South that continue. And of course, one manifestation of that in tensions between Samaritan communities and Judean communities. And
Mhm.
much of that is kind of an object of debate in the earlier periods too, where we see, yes, points of tension between
Hmm.
northern and southern Yahwists. But it really comes later in the game than we usually suspect. And it's really under the Hasmoneans and some of the oppressive measures of the Hasmoneans toward their northern neighbors, that really was the seed for a lot of the animosity. But in the earlier times, there would be certainly points of conflict, but also points of cooperation and collaboration. And some scholars will try to see evidence of that in the texts of the Pentateuch, where we have both northern and southern perspectives presented.
Interesting. And so in all of this, and even going back to your time period specifically, how are you seeing the things that you're finding in the excavations illuminating the Old Testament?
Sure. Well, I think, one thing, if you ever want to have any idea of kind of visual pictures and spaces for understanding what ancient Israelite sacrifice might have been like, you don't go to Jerusalem because
Hmm.
obviously there's no remnants of that earliest phase there.
Hmm.
But you can go to Tel Dan and see at least the Parks Authority reconstruction, which has some some pros and cons to it. You can get an idea of what an ancient Israelite space of worship might have looked like. And you can even go through some of the movements of the sacrificial procedures there. I mean, not with a real animal, killing an animal
Right.
or something like that, but
Praise God.
that's right. But in terms of the syntax of offering, I call it, the movements through the space. And this is, I think, a whole largely untapped avenue of the study of ancient Israelite religion. And it's becoming, many scholars are now recognizing the value in this sort of approach and are embracing it. And this idea that if we think of religion just as, it's notoriously difficult to define what religion actually is. Are we talking about belief? Are we talking about practice? And we, in our modern day and age, we often, because many of our religious systems, especially those of us with Christian backgrounds or Jewish backgrounds, or we think of belief first, that religion is a set of beliefs and practice is subordinate to that. Well, it certainly would have been equal, if not greater, a greater degree, much more of an emphasis placed on the actual actions of religion, repetitive actions in spaces that kind of are part of this idea that religion, by its very essence, seeks to engage something, to make empirical something that is non-empirical.
Mm-hmm.
And these actions, these rituals, help us understand what that might be like. And so you have that within ancient Israelite religion and many religious systems today. I mean, we still celebrate the Lord's Supper. And depending on which Christian tradition you come from, there are relative degrees of ritual that are still part of our tradition. But it's that is a essential part for ancient Israelite religion, and you can really get a new window on that in spaces like Tel Dan, or in the south, the Arad Temple, or now the recently discovered Moza Temple, though that's not accessible anymore. So yeah, that can be another, I think, helpful thing in terms of making a connection between ancient artifacts and ancient religion.
Yeah, wow. Very interesting. So, what would you say if somebody were to ask you, like we're about to ask you,
Like I'm about to.
what are the top 5 things that you've discovered at Tel Dan that were unexpected?
Sure. Yeah, and I've been talking all about Tel Dan, and I've not mentioned the most famous discovery there that has nothing to do with directly with what we've been talking about
Yeah.
thus far, and that's the Tel Dan inscription
Oh
that
yeah.
was discovered in 1993 and 1994 under the Baran excavation. So that was before I was part of the project, but that's certainly the most famous artifact from the site. And for your listeners who might not be familiar with that discovery, it's fragments of an Aramaic stela that was likely set up by the Aramean Hazael as a victory stela, a conquest stela, celebrating his overthrow of certain Omrides under successors of Ahab, and in it it's in a broken context, so there's some debate about this, but seemingly mentions King of the North, King of Israel, and the King of the South. And the interesting thing, the thing that makes the inscription most famous, is that in describing the king of the south, he doesn't say the king of Judah, but he says the king of the house of David. So it maps very closely with the story of the coup of Jehu. So we have
Mhm.
an interesting biblical connection there, though seemingly attributing it in the biblical account to Jehu and in the Stela to Hazael, though Hazael is not actually named in the Stela, so that's another matter. But this term, House of David, is the earliest reference to King David in archaeological materials,
Wow.
so outside the Bible, and it's within a century or so of historical David. So there's another early reference on the Mesha Stela, but it's right on a crack, and we have the squeeze from the original, but that's another matter. So anyway, that's the most famous
Okay.
historical document from Tel Dan. But to get to your question, for
Yeah.
me, the most exciting thing I think I found was not any one artifact, but rather one of my research projects was the coordination of some biblical text and an artifact that was found under Biran. And then the second thing was in one of my subfields is the analysis of animal bone remains, so zooarchaeology, and looking at some of the data that I amassed from the Buran excavations, noticing some patterns there that were quite surprising to me. And then those two discoveries kind of building toward really reshaping my view of what's going on in the sanctuary. So first, the artifact. So this is
Yeah.
a bowl, a bronze bowl that was discovered by Biran in the sacred precinct, in the temple area, in the
Okay.
western chambers. And it was a bronze bowl that could be held in the hand that was found along with a pair of shovels that were found as a pair, nested one inside the other, kind of laying as a pair. And then there was a third shovel adjacent to the pair of shovels, all gathered around a small altar there. And so I saw this bowl and this pair of shovels, and then this long-handled shovel. And I started looking at the biblical texts that describe so-called priestly altar kits, and
Hmm.
they consist of a bowl, a pair of shovels, and a long-handled shovel as an incense pan, and sometimes a fork and a pot for collecting ashes. And so here you have the bowl, the pair of
Yeah.
shovels, the long handled, and I failed to mention a sunken pot with burned animal bone remains.
Oh,
And
wow.
Ah,
the only thing that was missing
no
was the
fork.
fork, and the fork's only in some lists and not in others. And then I was talking about this with a colleague, and he said, "Oh, go back to the reports. There was a long iron handle found on the doorstep that, what do you call a three-pronged fork with missing two
Yeah.
prongs, a long, long iron handle. And so we may have the fork as well.
Oh, wow.
So this is just one of those really unbelievable in a way sort of things where you read something in the text and then you find in the dirt this same collection of artifacts
Wow.
gathered around an altar that are precisely the same artifacts that are used for altar service in the biblical text.
Wow.
Now,
So,
another kind of interesting thing about that is if my analysis is correct, the purpose of that bowl is to catch the blood of the sacrificial animal. So that is not uniquely, but it is distinctively Israelite, in terms of the manipulation of blood. We do have some
Hmm.
Hittite texts and some other contexts where we have the manipulation of blood, but it would be really all the more remarkable. Now, admittedly, one of my colleagues is soon to publish a paper that will argue that Biran's dating, which I adopted in my analysis, is actually too early, and that these should be redated to the Persian period. So I'll have to adjust some of
Hmm.
my conclusions if I'm convinced by that data. And what she's shown me so far is pretty solid. I may have some revising to do. But it still is remarkable as an example of an altar kit for the worship of Yahweh in an actual temple setting that is mentioned in the biblical text.
Jonathan, when you find something like that, I mean, what's going through your mind? Are you like, oh my goodness, or are you like, oh well, you're a little cautious?
Yeah. No, it's very exciting to me, and that was kind of part one in reshaping my view of what's going on in the temple there. So,
Yeah,
admittedly, if you just read through these stories quickly, you're thinking if you're going to find any evidence that correlates to the Bible, it's going to be evidence of the worship of Baal, or
yeah,
they're sacrificing pigs, or these are the bad guys, these are the northern,
Right.
right?
yeah,
And then, wait, I found an altar kit. Well, I didn't find it. Biran found the altar kit, but we can look at the correlations between that and the biblical stuff and say, wait a minute, this is the kit they're supposed to be using.
yeah,
Uh, and then the second thing, and this really shifted my thinking of the precinct, is the animal bone remains.
Hmm.
So I looking at some of Biran's reports and then working with the material remains myself and the animal bone remains that were preserved and held in the storerooms of the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. I started looking at collections of deposits that were from sacred meals from the Iron Age, and
hmm,
looking at the bones in terms of what animals these bones came from, but then also the percentages of different types of bones. And I noticed that in the area that was associated with the priests, where these artifacts were found, the bowl, and also some other things that led us to believe that this was an area of priests, I noticed that there was a statistically sound difference between right-sided portions and left-sided portions.
hmm,
And that the right-sided portions for the hind limbs and for the forelimbs, there were about two-thirds to one-third right-sided to left-sided. And then I looked at the bones of the feasting deposits in the courtyard, and I found that it was almost exactly the opposite,
good.
where it
Wow.
was two-thirds left to one-thirds right. So what would attribute to, all of these right-sided portions, being statistically significant difference here in the priestly area? Well, we remember that multiple times in the priestly texts you have priests prescribed the right hind limb, or in some traditions the forelimb. But it's always the right. Whenever the side is mentioned, it's always the right-sided. So again, it looks like, they're following, or at
Yeah.
least consistent, congruent with what we will see in biblical texts as well, in terms of the prescription for the right side of the animal. And so those are just two, and I have
Yeah.
a longer list, and it's part of an ongoing project that I'm working on that would suggest that what we see in the Temple of Tel Dan is actually our best example of Yahwistic worship that has a higher degree of correspondence to priestly ritual texts than previously assumed. Now, the
Yeah.
dating of those texts is another matter of debate, and so the form that we're looking at in the Bible as we have it is later, but it may preserve some of these earlier things that we can identify archaeologically.
Yeah. Fascinating. Wow. Well, I appreciate so much your work. I mean, you're working not in what might be thought of as an easily accessible area, especially in this day and age. What are some of the
Right.
challenges that that's presenting to your work there?
Sure. Yeah, it's the challenges are are many, and
Yeah.
I think some of it is just at the personal level and the humanitarian level, the Christian level,
Mm,
where it feels inappropriate to be carrying out intellectual delights of the mind
Right.
and looking at biblical questions of long ago in light of so much horrific human suffering all
Mm.
around. So I think for me personally, that's the biggest hurdle is saying that what we do as archaeologists is valuable and worthwhile, and continuing that work, but not in a way that turns a blind eye or brackets out
Hmm.
many of the horrific realities that are all around in such a context. So I
Mm.
think that's one big challenge. The other is, of course, logistically, as we're concerned for potential safety risks. We're right along the border of Syria and Lebanon in Israel, so it's obviously a complicated place to be in terms of security measures.
Hmm.
And then there are the logistical matters concerning recent political developments in our own country and how that relates to the nations around. Even as simple as importing, exporting material, let alone travel. So there are lots and lots of challenges certainly in this work, and continue to be led because of my Christian conviction for peace,
Right.
and care and love for my fellow humans across the board, regardless of nationality or ethnicity. And archaeology, I see very much under those things, but still important as we try to understand the past and the ramifications of that on that of that past on our present.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I can't imagine those challenges that you're facing, but still the optimism that you have, and I know that you're excited about this dig season coming up.
Yeah.
Anything that you're anticipating that's particularly exciting?
Well, we are under Yifat's direction returning to Area T, which is the temple area, the sacred precinct.
Mm.
So that's always my favorite area in terms of that's
Right.
where my specific research lies. So who knows what we will find? It's an ongoing joke between us, where Yafat has a particular interest in the Assyrians and I in the religion. And so we're always hoping for an inscription. So I want a dedicatory inscription of Jeroboam for the temple, and she
Sure.
wants a Tiglath-Pileser inscription referring to the annex of Dan. So I guess the happy solution we would like both of those things.
Yeah.
So any inscription would be that's really a dream, because those give you a window into some of these things that you have to reconstruct by non-literary remains.
Yeah. Well, I imagine you've written a couple volumes. Tell us about those, and we want to encourage our listeners to support your work and you through the
Yeah. Chase
purchase
them
of
down.
those.
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote a technical work that was a published form of my dissertation that I would never encourage anybody to buy, because they are,
I
you
like
know,
all the words you're using around it. It's very technical. It's very long. Please don't go there.
but I'm happy to report, thanks to a grant from, I'm now at Grand Valley State University, and thanks to an open access grant initiative, that is actually free now. So it's an easy title to remember, Dinner at Dan. So for any who want the technical details, that's an open access a publication through Brill Academic Publishers. And then what might be of interest to more of your listeners, that's really, I hope, accessible to all people, from interested lay folk to college graduates, seminarians, and even professors as a ready reference. I was the one of the co-editors of a volume called Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament. And that project began as a textbook I was planning to write. And then I was thinking, as I looked around and I had all these wonderful friends who knew far more than I did about all of these topics, wouldn't it be cool to draw on experts to write these individual chapters? And then I teamed up with one of my then colleagues, John Hilber. And then we also, through a connection with John Hilber, added John Walton to the mix. And the three of us together were overwhelmed by the response of many of our friends and colleagues who contributed to this volume. So I feel I don't have any conflict of interest with endorsing this because I didn't actually write anything. So you're not getting it from me. That's what I would say to my students. I mean, it helps me if you buy the book for
Right.
sure. But in terms of the scholarship, it's really, it was my joy and privilege to be able to promote the scholarship of my friends and colleagues. So that was an edited volume there. And then we kind of designed the volume in a way that the chapters are short and up to date. I mean, it was published a few years ago now, but that may be of interest to some of your readers. And then I have a number of other sorts of technical works that I'm happy to send anyone who's interested in terms of academic articles, and have another edited volume with some other colleagues and things. So yeah, and then hopefully some things forthcoming as well.
Great. Well, you failed to mention what might be the most important volume that you've written, co-authored with your wife.
Oh, well, that's because that was actually never published. So
it wasn't.
Oh,
What?
No, we due to some internal complications with shifting careers for both of us and the like, that was not yet published. We hope to be able to return to that volume soon and have significant chunks written, but hopefully that will get out there, because that was another one very much designed for a broader audience in something that's far beyond Tel Dan, but an interest that we both have to emphasize the importance of understanding the ancient context for reading biblical texts in a I hope in a more responsible manner that takes very seriously the context in which the Bible came first to fellow humans long ago.
right. Context.
There you go.
Man, Dr. Greer, I first of all, I'm very much looking forward to this forthcoming, whenever it be finished, book. But we're excited to know that you have joined forces with other smarties and academics to get us behind. You say Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament? Is that the name of the volume?
Yeah, that one. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your work. Thank you for the work that you have done and you are doing. We will prayerfully pray for all the inscriptions that just answer half of the questions that you have had there at Tel Dan,
There
and
you
maybe
go.
even a few bonus ones for your coworkers as well. But thank you for joining us, Dr. Greer, and listeners. Thank you for joining us in this next chapter of our Archaeology Meets Missiology series that we have been doing. If you haven't caught all of those from our series, please go back, listen to them again. But we don't just talk archaeology here on the Ephesiology Podcast, so go and peruse other topics and things that we have covered. We desire to continue educating others theologically, and we do so online. So if you want to go to masterclasses.ephesiology.com, you can see how can we help equip you and with what topics we can kind of put in your repertoire to get you to where God is taking you and continue to be used for his good in this world. So for Michael, for Jonathan, and myself, thank you for joining us today on the Ephesiology Podcast.